cellular and seeing how cellular respiration can be used in biotech to create food products such as yogurt and wine and beer and so forth. But today what we're going to be seeing is how cellular respiration can be used to make renewable energy. All these biofuels that we're placing into our cars, and when you pump your car filled with 10% ethanol anytime you go to the gas station, that's what you're doing. Where are these biofuels coming from? How does that involve biotechnology? It does involve cellular respiration, and so just to make sure we're all on the same page, cellular respiration in general is that process to be able to go from having sugar and then feeding that sugar to a living organism that converts that to ATP that the organism needs, plus some waste products. In the case of yeast, that sugar is converted to ATP that the yeast cells need, plus carbon dioxide that can be used to cause the dough to rise in the case of bread, or to make wine and beer in the case of ethanol. But today, rather than looking at ethanol as a food product, instead ethanol can also be used as an energy source to power engines. That when we burn that ethanol, there's a lot of heat, a lot of energy in there, and that heat energy can be used to power a whole bunch of different types of engines. It's just that you need to find a source of simple sugars. And when I say simple sugars, if you recall back to biology, we drew out simple sugars as being just one hexagon, such as glucose was a simple sugar, one sugar, a monosaccharide, or even disaccharides, two sugars linked together, like sucrose. Those are examples of simple sugars. And there are a whole bunch of different simple sugars that are out there, including simple sugars coming straight from sugar cane. And that means that in places such as Brazil, that is capable of growing sugar cane because they have the right climate, they're able to have most of the biofuels that they produce, the ones that they put into their cars, coming from that sugar cane production. That by taking that sucrose or glucose from the sugar cane, they're able to feed that to yeast and allow the yeast to make the ethanol that they need. There's other sugars available. It's not just simple sugars. There's also complex sugars, polysaccharides, a whole bunch of sugars linked together. And there's even more sources of complex sugars than there are sources of simple sugars, including starch. If you recall from biology, starch, a complex sugar, is one that plants produce after having gone through photosynthesis. After photosynthesis, the plant takes the simple sugars and sends that down to the root to be packaged together as complex sugars that the plant can then use to store that energy for long periods of time. In order for us to make use of that for biofuel production, we can't feed yeast this large structure here. Instead, we have to take that large complex sugar, that starch, and digest it into simpler sugars. This is going to require enzymes. So enzymes, remember, are proteins that catalyze a chemical reaction, in some cases to build things, but today looking at ones that tear apart. So here we have a complex sugar, and we're going to use our enzyme, this pair of scissors here, to tear apart the complex sugar, break those bonds into individual simple sugars like glucose. In the case of digesting starch, the name of the enzyme is one that's called amylase. Amylase takes starch and digests that into simple sugars. Once we have that in the simple sugar form, then we can feed those simple sugars to yeast, which then convert that simple sugar into the ethanol that becomes our biofuel. Yeast cellular respiration enzymes only work on simple sugars, and again, because each protein has its own unique shape, that means that the simple or the cellular respiration enzymes that yeast use can't feed on this large structure. They need to have these individual sugars. The analogy would be kind of like if I gave you a little piece of pizza, you would be easily able to place that in your mouth and digest it. On the other hand, if I said, here's the entire pie, the entire pizza pie, if you had to place that in your mouth and digest it, it just wouldn't work. You'd have to cut it into smaller pieces first. The same is true with yeast. They only feed on simple sugars. And so we can take starch from sources such as corn, but then we'd have to break that apart into simpler sugars first. Enzymes such as amylase digest starch into simple sugars and are readily available. The saliva that you have contains a lot of amylase, and so does the saliva from a whole bunch of other living organisms. So we can get large amounts of amylase. We can even genetically engineer bacteria to contain that amylase gene and produce as much amylase as we want. In the US, most biofuel is made this way, using starch from corn. That starch, again, broken down and then fed to yeast. It does create a little bit of a problem here in the United States, though, using corn in multiple ways. Really, we're using corn for not just fuel, but we're also using it for food, which means that if we have these two purposes for corn, then that means that using more and more corn for fuel will only drive up the price of corn for food. In fact, since 2000, the percentage of the U.S. corn crop that is grown for ethanol production has approached 40%. That's a huge percentage of the U.S. corn crop that is going towards fuel versus food. And if we take a look at the harvest, like in this picture down below, even once we take the cob away that has all the kernels with the starch in it, there's a lot of that plant that's still left behind. The leaves and the stalk are still there. All that material is called stover. Is there a way that we could use the rest of the corn plant for fuel? And the answer is yes. There's another complex sugar that's found in the rest of the corn plant that is called cellulose. Plant cell walls are made of a complex sugar called cellulose, and while I've drawn that out to look a lot like the starch on the previous slide, the reality is that there's small little chemical changes, the arrangement of the bonds that make cellulose and starch different. But it's still a complex sugar. These plant cell walls have a lot of cellulose in them to provide strength to that plant cell wall. Remember, plants don't have a skeleton, and so they need their cell walls to be strong. So the cellulose gives cell walls strength. It's not used as energy for plants, because if the plants broke down that cellulose for energy, well, then their cell walls would be weak and the plant would fall down and die. So they're not using cellulose as an energy source. In order for us to make use of it in the cellular respiration pathway, we have to digest that cellulose into simple sugars. We can't use amylase, because remember, amylase works only on starch. Instead, we have to use an enzyme called cellulase. So this is the same diagram from the previous screen. However, instead of using amylase, here we're using cellulase to break the bonds that hold these glucose molecules together that made the cellulose sugar. So we'd first have to take cellulose, the sugar, and treat it with cellulase, the enzyme, to break that apart into simple sugars, and then feed those simple sugars to yeast to make the ethanol that it would be our biofuel. Unfortunately, there's not many sources of the enzyme called cellulase, and I'm going to have you do a reading on this to learn a little bit about an interesting possibility when it comes to a source for this special enzyme. There's also one more limitation of cellulose, however. This diagram is showing cellulase. It's kind of hard to see because it's impossible to see the individual hexagons that are here, but they're arranged in these yellow bars. So this is a large amount of cellulose that's providing strength to the cell wall. So a whole bunch of them arranged together here. But you'll notice that the cellulose isn't on its own, that it's surrounded by this purple and then also orange strands. And these are called hemicellulose in purple and lignin in orange. That cellulose is wrapped in a protective covering called lignin, and that lignin must be removed from the cellulose before cellulose can be digested by the enzyme cellulase. We have to get rid of it. And in order for that lignin to be removed, scientists are still working on the most efficient process that would work, but they're using methods including high heat and ammonia to try to get rid of that lignin. So in that process is called pre-treatment. Cellulose surrounded by lignin has to be separated so that we can have cellulose on its own. We then take the cellulose and treat it with cellulase to break that down into simple sugars, which then can be fed to the yeast to make the ethanol that we want to use in our cars. So it's a very complicated process, and although scientists are getting it to work, and there is one biofuel plant that's up and running in Wisconsin, most of the biofuels that our country produces come from starch. instead of coming from cellulose. So, if harvesting complex sugars from stover is such a pain, why bother, and why not just stick with starch instead? Well, the reality is not just starch from corn is used as a food source, but also cellulose is the most abundant biomolecule on the planet. Over 50% of the Earth's biomass is cellulose. Now, you haven't really encountered that term biomass yet. What biomass means is that if we took a list of all the organic molecules that are found on Earth, all the carbohydrates, all of the fats, all of the proteins, all the DNA, and made a list of every single last one of them, and then went around the world and estimated how much mass is there for each one. For example, for hemoglobin that carries oxygen in red blood cells, in the entire world, how much does all of that hemoglobin weigh? Or how much does all of that special type of phospholipid that makes up your cell membranes, how much does that weigh? And keep on going through all the different biomolecules that are out there. Out of the thousands of different biomolecules that are present on the Earth, 50% of the Earth's biomass is made out of cellulose. That's an amazingly high number. Because again, the list of biomolecules is in the thousands, and yet 50% of the Earth's biomass is cellulose, which means when we take a look at this picture of this harvesting of switchgrass, that it's not just the plants like switchgrass, but the trees that are in the background and all the different plants that are out there that contain cellulose in them. Cellulose doesn't just come from corn plants or from sugar cane or things like that, but any plant contains cellulose, trees, grasses, prairie plants, and so this makes it a very renewable, very sustainable type of energy form. Certainly there's oil, and it took many millions of years for that material to break down into the oil form, but we keep producing more and more plants every single year. And so a lot of research is going into figuring out which plants produce the most cellulose, which ones produce ones with cellulose that's not covered by much lignin, or genetically engineering the plants to have lots of cellulose or very little lignin. And so a lot of work is being done to look at this possibility, because again, 50% of the Earth's biomass being cellulose, there's a lot of potential energy there that we could then be feeding to yeast to make ethanol. The next screen here is showing links to a variety of different videos, and I do want you to find the link to the actual presentation, the actual PowerPoint slides, so that you can watch these videos. The first one here does a great job of summarizing everything that we just presented here and giving some additional detail. I think this video is really important to watch, and it's put out by the Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Center, part of which is based at UW-Madison. This video is wonderful too. It talks a lot about or shows you the process of processing cellulose into ethanol, and I think it does a great job of